Two sounds defined the spring of 1941, a dissonant symphony of a world tearing itself apart. The first was the sound of survival, the relentless rhythmic printing of banknotes deep in the vaults of the Bank of England, a mechanical heartbeat pushing paper wealth into a voracious war effort. It was the roar of factories across the Midlands and the Clyde, the shriek of metal forging Spitfires and shells. A nation was straining every muscle to feed a war machine, facing an existential darkness. The second sound was the sound of a slow, inevitable drowning, not a roar, but a quiet, desperate sip. Faint echo in the marble halls of the Treasury in Whitehall, the whisper of a vault door closing on an empty chamber. It was the sound of a centuries-old financial reservoir running dry. Britain stood alone, a bastion fighting for what many believed was the future of the free world. And with each passing day, it was going bankrupt. This isn't a story of battles and blood, though its consequences were as decisive as any fought on the beaches of Normandy or in the skies over Britain. This is a story of numbers, of cold, hard figures in leather-bound ledgers that became weapons as potent as any tank division. It's the story of a financial ultimatum so severe, so strategically crafted, it didn't just fund a war. It surgically dismantled the economic architecture of a global empire, a conflict waged in conference rooms and over cable traffic, where the ammunition was sovereign debt and the battlefield was the future of international commerce. Welcome to Dominion Archives. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on the secret transaction that irrevocably changed the global order. We'll trace the journey of gold across an ocean and of power from one capital to another. This is the moment America ceased being just a lender to the Allied cause and transformed for good into the architect of the post-war world. Picture a fortress under siege. Its walls in 1940 and 41 were strong, forged from the courage of the Royal Air Force and the unbreakable will of its people during the Blitz. The ramparts held. But inside the keep, within the financial citadel, a colder reality set in. The granaries were empty. The coffers echoed with a hollow, terrifying silence. The war was being fought on credit, and that credit was evaporating. By 1940, Britain's strategy was one of financial triage. To buy the American tanks, planes, and food needed to survive, they paid in the only currency that required no credit: gold, the lifeblood of empires. Ship after ship, running the gauntlet of U-boat wolf packs, crossed the Atlantic. Their hulls were filled not with soldiers, but with ingots, the centuries-old accumulated wealth of the British Empire. In the basements of the New York Federal Reserve, gold bars were stacked like cordwood, fueling a distant war. Each bar that left London was a piece of financial sovereignty, surrendered. Then came the cash. When the gold reserves dwindled to a trickle, Britain began the agonizing process of selling off its family jewels, its global financial patrimony. These weren't just assets. They were the embodiment of a century of imperial investment, shares in American railroads and industrial giants built over generations by British capital. It was a fire sale of empire, conducted under the duress of existential threat. Treasury officials negotiated away future income and strategic influence for the immediate cash to survive. But war is an insatiable beast. Its appetite for dollars was far faster than any sales could satisfy. The wolf wasn't just at the door. It was in the counting house. Into this dire breach stepped Winston Churchill's secret financial weapon, a quiet, brilliant, and desperate civil servant named Sir Frederick Phillips. Unassuming, a master of the spreadsheet, his mission was one of last resort. Cross the Atlantic, go to Washington, a city simmering with isolationist sentiment, and get the money. Secure the lifeline, at any cost. Phillips arrived as a supplicant. The United States was legally bound by the strict neutrality acts, and politically shackled by a powerful America First movement, yet personally led by a president who saw the writing on the wall. Franklin Delano Roosevelt understood the strategic need for a Britain that could hold the line. He wanted to help. But he, and the powerful interests he represented, also saw a historic, transformative opportunity. America was on the cusp of shedding its role as merely the arsenal of democracy. It was preparing to become its banker, its guarantor, and in doing so, its architect. What followed was a masterclass in financial realpolitik, a slow-motion negotiation where one side held all the cards and the other was playing for its life. Roosevelt offered a lifeboat, but it was a vessel built to his specifications, headed for a port he had chosen. The Lend-Lease Act, passed in March 1941, sounded like an act of unparalleled generosity. We'll lend you the supplies. You can pay us back in kind after the war. The public rhetoric was all about shared sacrifice. But the fine print, particularly the notorious Article VIII, contained the seeds of a quiet revolution. This clause demanded that the final settlement would include the end of all forms of discriminatory treatment in international commerce. The translation was starkly clear to the British cabinet. To get American aid, Britain had to agree, in principle, to dismantle its Imperial Preference System. This system was the very economic engine of the empire. Established in 1932, it created a protected trading bloc. Tariffs were lowered between Britain and its colonies and dominions, while walls were kept up against outsiders, especially the United States. It guaranteed markets for British goods and secured raw materials. It was the economic expression of the empire on which the sun never sets. America, through Article VIII, was demanding the keys to this closed shop. They were forcing open these protected markets, demanding a new world order of free trade, a system where unchallenged American industrial and agricultural supremacy would dominate. For Britain, signing was an act of slow-motion economic suicide. But the alternative, a sudden, catastrophic cutoff of the supplies holding the German military at bay, was immediate physical suicide. The choice was between a future of diminished power or no future at all. The abstract pressure of Article VIII became terrifyingly concrete in the high summer of 1941. Britain's commercial credit in the United States was gone. A single massive payment for American shipbuilding, a sum in the tens of millions, was due, and the vaults were bare. The U.S. Treasury, under the stern leadership of Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr., presented the bill, and with the cold finality of a banker calling it a loan, they gave the British just 24 hours to find the cash. It was a brutal demonstration of leverage, pure financial coercion. With no other option, the British government was forced to do the unthinkable. From London, a desperate cable authorized the seizure, the compulsory, state-mandated purchase, of all remaining private British investments in the United States. Every stock, every bond owned by British citizens, from giant insurance companies to individual savers. It was a desperate internal raid, an act of fiscal self-cannibalization. The state was stripping the wealth of its own people to pay the foreign landlord. The cornerstone of private property was sacrificed on the altar of national survival. They scraped together the payment, a humiliating transaction that staved off disaster for a few more weeks. But the message was seared into the soul of the British state. You are no longer a sovereign equal. You are a financial vassal. The master of the global financial world was no longer in the city of London. Its new address was on the corner of Liberty Street and Maiden Lane in New York. The formal signing of the Lend-Lease Master Agreement wasn't a partnership between equals. It was a surrender of economic autonomy, signed not on the deck of a battleship, but on a balance sheet dot. But the story doesn't end with the signature. The true weight of this new reality settled in during the long, grinding years that followed. Every convoy of Liberty ships, every shipment of powdered eggs and spam, every P-51 Mustang that rolled off a stateside assembly line was now a line item in a ledger of profound dependency. For American officials, Lend-Lease was not charity. It was a strategic investment with strings attached so fine they were nearly invisible, yet strong enough to tie down a lion. Treasury Secretary Morgenthau and his aides maintained a meticulous, some would say merciless, accounting. They audited British consumption down to the last dollar, questioning expenses and demanding justification, treating the finances of a sovereign ally with the scrutiny of a loan officer for a risky mortgage. This constant oversight chafed at British pride, a daily reminder of their diminished station. The special relationship was being forged, but in the furnace of American oversight, it was a relationship between a banker and a client dot. Meanwhile, across America, the war was triggering an economic miracle. Factories that had lain dormant during the Depression were now running 3 shifts, humming with unprecedented activity. The gold sitting in the New York Fed's vaults wasn't just collateral. It was rocket fuel for the American century. It provided the bedrock confidence that allowed the U.S. government to spend massively, knowing its currency was unshakable. While British cities were scarred by bombs, American cities sprouted new suburbs. While Britain rationed everything from butter to gasoline, America's home front boomed. This staggering divergence wasn't an accident. It was the direct, calculated outcome of the financial term set in 1941. The United States wasn't just avoiding the physical destruction of war. It was leveraging the conflict to achieve permanent economic supremacy. The human dimension of this financial siege was felt in British homes and boardrooms. The compulsory purchase of American investments didn't just balance a ledger. It shattered personal financial security for a generation. Families who had relied on dividends from U.S. stocks saw that future income vanish overnight, converted into a one-time, state-mandated payment that was often below market value. It was a quiet, nationwide expropriation to pay a foreign power. In the corridors of the city, financiers watched in stunned silence as the pillars of London's status as the world's banker were pulled down, one by one. The financial capital of the world was moving, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The war against Hitler was being won, but a quieter, more profound war for economic primacy was being lost in plain sight. This shift in power was psychological as much as it was financial. For centuries, British statesmen had operated with a deeply ingrained sense of imperial confidence. Now, they had to navigate a new humility. Telegrams to Washington were drafted not with demands, but with requests. Strategic decisions, from the timing of offensives to the allocation of resources, were increasingly run past American counterparts for approval, or at least for financial blessing. The relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt, often painted as a warm friendship, was underpinned by this stark imbalance. Churchill's famous flair for oratory and persuasion was in part a tool to manage his nation's greatest creditor. He was not just leading a war effort, he was performing for a patron dot. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the true long-term reckoning began. Britain stood victorious. Her people hailed as heroes, and yet the nation was utterly ruined. The war had consumed over a quarter of her pre-war national wealth. The Lend-Lease debt, while settled for cents on the dollar, was still colossal. But the real, enduring debt wasn't in dollars or pounds. It was a geopolitical debt dot. The empire, already strained, was now strangled by debt and bound by the free trade chains of the Lend-Lease agreements. Without its protected markets and economically bled white, it could no longer afford the military, the bureaucracy, or the subsidies to hold its vast territories. The sun was setting in a managed, financially necessitated retreat. India gained independence in 1947. Across Africa and Asia, the process accelerated, and across the Atlantic, a new dawn was being financed. Ironically, by the very gold that had sailed from London's docks. That gold now backed the burgeoning might of the American economy. The final, elegant twist was the design of the post-war economic system itself. The Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 wasn't a meeting of equals to rebuild a shattered world. It was where the victor, the creditor, the nation with the intact factories and full vaults, wrote the rules. The system was designed by America for American interests. The US dollar, its value anchored to the immense gold reserves swollen by British transfers, was enshrined as the world's primary reserve currency. International trade would be done in dollars. Global liquidity would be controlled through Washington and New York. The victor didn't just win the war, he wrote the rulebook for the peace, ensuring he would win every subsequent economic game. This seismic shift echoed in the corridors of power for decades. The 1956 Suez Crisis would provide the final, stark proof of the New World Order. When Britain, France and Israel invaded Egypt to reclaim the Suez Canal. They did so without Washington's approval. President Eisenhower, furious, didn't send troops. He sent a financial ultimatum. He threatened to collapse the British pound by blocking an emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund, an institution America dominated. Faced with the imminent devaluation of their currency, the British government, under Prime Minister Anthony Eden, had no choice but to order a humiliating withdrawal. The message was now undeniable. Major military action by a European power required American financial permission. The torch of global hegemony had not just been passed, it had been purchased, and the receipt was stored in the archives of the U.S. Treasury. The legacy of this financial takeover is the world we live in today. The dominance of the U.S. dollar, the structure of institutions like the IMF and World Bank, the very framework of globalized trade, all bear the fingerprints of decisions made between 1940 and 1945. It was a bloodless conquest, achieved not with tanks, but with treasury bonds, not with invasions, but with invoices. The British Empire didn't just fade away, it was quietly foreclosed upon. The United States mastered a new kind of power, the power to create dependency, to set the terms of engagement, and to profit from the very survival of its allies. It was a blueprint for superpower status that relied less on occupying territory and more on controlling the global financial bloodstream. This is the ultimate lesson written in the faded ink of those World War II Treasury ledgers. Power doesn't always follow the flag, it follows the capital. Armies can conquer land, but it is finance, the control of credit, the architecture of trade, the dominance of currency, that conquers futures and shapes destinies. Britain, through unimaginable courage and sacrifice, won the war, but in the quiet, carpeted halls of the U.S. Treasury and on the trading floors of Wall Street, America won the peace. And with that peace, it claimed the coming century as its own. History remembers the roar of the guns, the thunderous speeches that stirred nations to valor, but it is often deaf to the whisper of the printing press, the soft scratch of a pen on a bond certificate, the cold click of a signature stamp on a loan agreement. That whisper can topple thrones. It can bankrupt empires from within, and from those ashes, it can meticulously build new empires of influence. The story of our modern world is written in three mediums: in the ink of treaties, in the blood of the fallen, and in the immutable, cold light of gold. This is the Dominion Archives. If you believe the past is the key to understanding the complex corridors of our present, help us unlock more vaults of history. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The next chapter, hidden in plain sight, is waiting.